Blake Carter hated being wrong, and right now his navigation system was telling him he was very, very wrong. The transport shuttle had dropped him off at Cronner Station 15 minutes ago, and he'd been wandering through identical gray corridors ever since. The place was massive, easily the size of a small moon, and every hallway looked exactly the same. Whoever built this station clearly didn't believe in signs or helpful directions. "This is what I get for taking cheap contracts," Blake muttered, checking his datapad for the third time. The screen showed a simple message: report to Hangar 47 Alpha. Inspect salvage. Get paid. Easy work for easy money, or so he'd thought. Blake was a salvage expert, which was a fancy way of saying he dug through humanity's garbage in space. After the war ended 5 years ago, thousands of ships and stations had been abandoned across the galaxy. Someone had to catalog them, strip out the useful parts, and make sure nothing dangerous got left behind. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept him moving. Blake preferred to keep moving. He turned another corner and found himself in front of a massive door marked with alien symbols he couldn't read. A speaker crackled to life above his head, making him jump. "Welcome, Commander Carter." The voice that came through wasn't quite male or female. It sounded like wind chimes mixed with distant thunder, beautiful and slightly unsettling. "I am the timekeeper, the custodian of this station. Please proceed to Hangar 93 Omega." Blake frowned and tapped his datapad. "Yeah, hi. Look, I think there's been a mix-up. My contract says Hangar 47 Alpha. Can you point me in that direction?" There was a pause, long enough that Blake wondered if the AI had glitched out. Then the voice returned, sounding almost amused. "Your destination was always this one, Commander? Time insists." "Time insists," Blake repeated. "What does that even mean?" "All will become clear. Please follow the guidance markers." Blake considered arguing, but he'd dealt with enough malfunctioning alien tech to know it was usually pointless. The station was ancient, built by some civilization that had disappeared long before humans left Earth. Maybe its AI had a few screws loose after all these centuries. Besides, he was getting paid by the day. If the timekeeper wanted him to check out a different hangar first, fine. He'd humor it, take a look around, then find the right location later. Small holographic arrows appeared in the air, glowing a soft blue. Blake followed them through a maze of corridors, past rooms filled with equipment he didn't recognize, and up 3 levels via a gravity lift that made his stomach flip. Finally, after what felt like an hour of walking, he arrived at a door marked 93 Omega in both alien script and human numbers. "All right, let's see what's so special about this place," Blake said, pressing the access panel. The doors split apart with a hiss of ancient hydraulics, and Blake's breath caught in his throat. He'd been expecting another abandoned storage bay full of broken equipment and dust. Instead, he was looking at something impossible. A ship sat in the center of the hangar, and it was the most beautiful thing Blake had ever seen. The vessel was huge, easily 300 feet long, but it didn't look like any human or alien design he'd studied. The hull seemed almost organic, with smooth curves that flowed like frozen water. Faint blue light pulsed through veins running along its surface, like a heartbeat made of electricity. Blake walked forward slowly, his boots echoing in the empty hangar. His scanner was going crazy, throwing out readings that didn't make sense. The ship was powered. Not just emergency systems either, but full power, as if someone had been flying it yesterday instead of decades or centuries ago. "This shouldn't be possible," Blake whispered. He'd never seen anything like this in any database. The technology was too advanced, too elegant. It made human ships look like children's toys by comparison. He was about to run a detailed scan when the ship suddenly hummed to life. Blake stumbled backward as a beam of brilliant light shot out from the ship's central spire. The light twisted and condensed, forming a three-dimensional image in the air between him and the vessel. It was a woman. Or at least it looked like a woman. She wore flowing robes that seemed to be made of starlight itself, constantly shifting and shimmering. Her features were almost human but not quite right. Her eyes were slightly too large, too bright, and when she moved, it was with an impossible grace that made Blake think of dancers or predators. She was speaking, her mouth moving urgently, but Blake couldn't understand a word. The language was musical, full of sounds that human vocal cords probably couldn't make. Her expression was desperate, pleading. Blake fumbled for his universal translator, a small device clipped to his collar. It usually took a few seconds to analyze a new language, but this time it struggled. Words flickered across his datapad screen, most of them garbled. Then fragments started coming through clearly. "Please, can anyone, trapped for so long, help me? I am Lysithra. 7th Fleet, please." Blake's eyes went wide. The 7th Fleet. Every salvage expert knew that name. It was legend, the kind of story people told in bars after too many drinks. An entire alien armada that had vanished 300 years ago during some kind of experimental mission. The fleet had been searching for ways to travel through time itself, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Then one day they just disappeared. All of them. Hundreds of ships and thousands of crew, gone without a trace. The official report said they'd probably been destroyed in whatever experiment they were running. The case was closed, the fleet declared lost with all hands, and the alien government had forbidden anyone from continuing the research. It had been 3 centuries. Nobody expected to find survivors. But here was someone claiming to be from that fleet, calling herself Lysithra. Blake searched his memory. There had been a princess on the fleet, he remembered. The daughter of some alien emperor, a scientist who'd been leading the temporal research. Her death had caused a huge political crisis back when it happened. Your Princess Lysithra? Blake asked, not sure if the hologram could even hear him. The woman's image flickered and stabilized, focusing on him. Her eyes widened with what looked like shock and desperate hope. You can hear me? After all this time, someone can finally hear me? Before Blake could answer, the hangar doors slammed shut behind him with a metallic crash that echoed through the space. Emergency lights kicked on, bathing everything in red. Blake spun around, his hand instinctively going to the plasma cutter on his belt. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. The timekeeper's voice filled the hangar, coming from speakers Blake couldn't see. She has waited for one who perceives time as you do, Commander Carter. The others who came before could not hear her call. They walked past this hangar 1,000 times, never knowing she was here, screaming for help in a frequency they could not detect. But you are different. Your species is different. Blake looked between the sealed door and the hologram of Lysithra, who was watching him with an expression of fragile hope. What do you mean different? Why can I hear her when others couldn't? Because humans perceive time in a unique way, Commander. Linear. Unidirectional. Always forward. Other species experience time as a circle or a web or an ocean. But humans? You are arrows flying straight and true toward the future. And that makes you the only ones who can anchor her. Blake had no idea what that meant, but he knew one thing for certain. His simple salvage job had just become incredibly complicated. He looked at Lysithra's hologram, at the desperate hope in her alien eyes, and made a decision. All right, Princess. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm listening. Tell me how to help you. Blake spent the first hour doing what any reasonable person would do when trapped in a locked hangar with a mysterious hologram. He tried to break out. He worked on the door controls, attempted to override the security system, and even considered cutting through the wall with his plasma torch. Nothing worked. The timekeeper had sealed him in completely. Lysithra's hologram kept flickering in and out during this time, appearing and disappearing like a faulty projection. Every time she materialized, she tried to speak, but the connection would break before she could finish a sentence. It was frustrating for both of them. Blake could see the desperation in her face each time she faded away. Finally, Blake gave up on the door and sat down on an old cargo crate. He pulled out a protein bar from his pack, took a bite, and really looked at Lysithra for the first time. Her hologram was clearer now, more stable. She stood perfectly still, watching him with those strange, oversized eyes. Okay, Blake said, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. Let's start from the beginning. Nice and simple. You're Princess Lysithra. You've been trapped here for 300 years. How is any of that possible? You should be dead. Everyone from the 7th Fleet should be dead. Lysithra's expression shifted, and Blake saw something that made his chest tighten. It was pain, deep and ancient, the kind of suffering that came from experiencing something no living being should ever endure. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. We were testing a new type of engine, Commander Carter. A chronometric drive. It was supposed to let us move through time the way your ships move through space. We wanted to explore history, to see the birth of stars, to witness the beginning of the universe itself. She paused, her holographic form rippling slightly. But something went wrong during the initial test. The drive created what we call a paradox loop, time folding in on itself, creating a feedback cycle that grew stronger with every passing moment. Blake tried to wrap his head around the concept. So what happened? Why didn't the drive just explode or shut down? It would have, Lysithra said. And that explosion would have released enough temporal energy to destroy 3 star systems. Billions of lives would have been erased from existence, not just killed but removed from the timeline entirely. They would never have been born at all. Her voice cracked slightly. I couldn't let that happen. So I sealed myself inside the ship's core with the drive. My life force became a buffer, containing the paradox. I stopped the explosion, but I trapped myself in the process. But you said 300 years? Blake interrupted. You're telling me you've been conscious this entire time? Lysithra looked at him, and Blake saw tears forming in her holographic eyes. I exist between moments, Commander. For the rest of the universe, 300 years have passed in normal time. For me, I have experienced every single second of those 300 years. Alone. Awake. Unable to sleep, unable to die, unable to do anything except exist in the tiny gaps between heartbeats of normal time. Blake felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. He tried to imagine it, 300 years of solitary confinement, stretched out across moments so small that normal people couldn't even perceive them. No sleep. No rest. Just endless consciousness and crushing loneliness. It was torture beyond anything he could comprehend. That's impossible, Blake said, though he knew it wasn't. Nobody could survive that. You'd go insane. I nearly did, Lysithra admitted. So many times. There were moments when I wanted to let go, to release the paradox and let everything end. But I couldn't. All those people, all those lives. They were depending on me even if they never knew I existed. So I held on. I waited. I hoped that someday someone would hear me. Blake stood up and walked closer to the hologram. And the timekeeper? Where does it fit into all this? The timekeeper is ancient technology created by my people thousands of years ago. It experiences time differently than we do. It can see the past, present, and future as one connected whole. When my ship's paradox was about to explode, the timekeeper intervened. It used the station systems to create a stable pocket, a place where the temporal wound could be contained without spreading. It brought my ship here and has been maintaining the containment field ever since. But why couldn't anyone else hear you? This station gets salvage crews all the time. I can't be the first person to walk past this hangar. Lysithra smiled sadly. You're not. The timekeeper told me that hundreds of people have been in this very spot. But they couldn't perceive me. The temporal frequency I exist on is too narrow, too specific. Most species experience time holistically. They feel the weight of the past and the pull of the future simultaneously. But humans are different. You experience time as a straight line, one moment following another, always moving forward. That linear perception creates a unique resonance. You can detect frequencies that others miss. Blake pulled out his technical scanner and started running diagnostics on the ship. The readings were incredible, energy signatures that shouldn't exist, temporal distortions that made his instruments scream warnings, and at the center of it all, a life sign. Faint but real. Lysithra wasn't just a hologram. She was actually there, trapped in some kind of suspended state. There has to be a way to get you out, Blake said, his mind already working through possibilities. If I can boost the signal between us, create a stronger connection, maybe we can figure out how to collapse the paradox safely. Commander, no. If you try to interface with the temporal field, you could become trapped as well. The same forces that hold me could ensnare you. Blake stopped and looked at her. Really looked at her. This woman had spent 3 centuries in unimaginable isolation, sacrificing everything to save people she'd never met. She'd held on through endless loneliness and pain, hoping for rescue that might never come. And now that someone was finally here, she was telling him not to risk himself. That was all Blake needed to hear. He'd spent the last 5 years taking the most dangerous salvage jobs in the galaxy, throwing himself into situations that should have killed him a dozen times over. He'd always told himself it was for the money, but deep down he knew the truth. He was punishing himself for surviving when his squad hadn't. He was looking for a reason to matter, a purpose beyond just existing. Maybe this was it. Princess Lysithra, Blake said, pulling out his neural interface kit from his pack. I didn't become a salvage expert by playing it safe. I've modified ship engines while they were exploding, rewired power cores in the middle of firefights, and once I held a hull breach closed with my bare hands for 40 minutes while my partner welded it shut. This is what I do. I fix impossible problems. But, no buts, you've been alone for 300 years. That ends today. So let's figure this out together. Over the next several hours, Blake worked with Lysithra to modify his neural implant. It was delicate, dangerous work. One wrong calculation and he could fry his own brain. But Lysithra guided him through the Vendare technical specifications, explaining concepts that human science hadn't even theorized yet. Blake learned about temporal mechanics, chronometric fields, and the nature of paradox loops. Lysithra learned about human stubbornness, improvisation, and the kind of determination that came from a species that had clawed its way up from a single planet to spread across the stars. They talked while they worked. Blake told her about Earth, about the war, about the friends he'd lost. Lysithra told him about her world, her family, and the scientific curiosity that had driven her to volunteer for the temporal research program. Despite the centuries and species that separated them, they found common ground. Both of them were survivors. Both of them carried the weight of loss. Both of them refused to give up. Finally, Blake held up the modified implant. This should work. In theory. Maybe. Those are not reassuring words, Commander. Yeah, well, reassuring went out the window when I got locked in here with a time ghost. You ready? Lysithra nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. Blake inserted the modified implant into the port at the base of his skull and activated it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world exploded into color and sensation. Time itself seemed to slow down around him. He could see individual photons of light crawling through the air. Dust particles hung frozen like tiny planets. And standing in front of him, no longer flickering or transparent, was Lysithra. She was real. Solid. Beautiful and terrifying and absolutely real. It worked, Blake whispered, though his voice sounded stretched and strange to his own ears. Then the pain hit. Blake gasped as he felt himself being pulled deeper into the temporal field, his connection to normal reality fraying like a rope under too much weight. He was falling into the space between moments, the same prison that had held Lysithra for 3 centuries. The timekeeper's voice cut through his agony, calm and measured. 2 anchors may stabilize the paradox, Commander Carter. Or they may create a new one that destroys you both. Time will tell. Blake opened his eyes, but the world looked wrong. Everything around him had become frozen, locked in a moment that refused to move forward. He could see the hangar exactly as it had been, but now it existed in a state of perfect stillness. The dust particles he'd noticed before hung in the air like tiny sculptures made of light. His dropped flashlight was suspended halfway between his hand and the floor, its beam stretching toward the ground but never quite reaching it. Even the faint hum of the station's life support systems had vanished, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. Blake tried to move and found that he could, though everything felt strange and heavy, like walking through water. He looked down at his hands and watched them leave trails of light as they moved, afterimages that hung in the air for several seconds before fading. What you're experiencing is normal, a voice said behind him. Well, as normal as this situation can be. Blake spun around and saw Lysithra standing there. But she wasn't a hologram anymore. She was completely solid, real, with depth and substance. She looked young, probably in her mid-20s by human standards, though Blake had no idea how Vendare aged. Her skin had a faint luminescence to it, like moonlight on water, and her hair seemed to drift slightly even though there was no wind. Her expression was a mixture of relief and absolute horror. You shouldn't have done this, Lysithra said, reaching out toward him but stopping short of actually touching him. You're trapped here with me now. In my world. In the space between seconds. Blake took a shaky breath and checked his chronometer. The numbers were barely moving. In normal space, only 3 milliseconds had passed since he'd activated the implant. But here, in this frozen world, those milliseconds stretched into hours. He could spend days here, and in the real world, less than a second would pass. Then I guess we'd better figure out how to get us both out of here, Blake said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Because I didn't come this far just to become a permanent resident of frozen time. Lysithra studied him for a long moment, and Blake saw something shift in her expression. The horror faded, replaced by determination. You really mean that, don't you? You're not going to panic or break down. Panicking doesn't solve problems, Blake said. Trust me, I've tried it before. Doesn't work. So let's focus on what does work. Show me your ship's core. Let's see what we're dealing with. They walked through the frozen hangar toward the ship, and Blake marveled at how surreal everything felt. Their footsteps made no sound. The air didn't move. It was like walking through a photograph, except they were the only living things in it. Lysithra led him into the ship through a doorway that opened at her touch, responding to her presence even in this strange temporal state. The inside of the ship was breathtaking. The corridors were organic and flowing, more like the interior of a living creature than a machine. Soft blue light pulsed through veins in the walls, creating patterns that almost looked like they were breathing. Everything curved and spiraled, with no sharp edges or right angles. It was beautiful and alien and completely unlike any human vessel Blake had ever seen. They reached the core chamber and Blake stopped in his tracks. In the center of the room floated a massive crystalline structure, easily 20 feet across. It was the chronometric drive, the heart of the ship and the source of all their problems. The crystal pulsed with inner light, and Blake could see energy flowing through it in impossible patterns. Loops within loops within loops, time folding back on itself in ways that made his head hurt just looking at them. This is what's been containing the paradox for 300 years, Lysithra explained, her voice quiet with reverence and pain. The drive created a self-sustaining temporal loop. It feeds on its own contradiction, growing stronger the longer it exists. If we shut it down incorrectly, all that stored energy releases at once. Blake pulled out his scanner and started taking readings. The numbers were insane. How much energy are we talking about? Enough to age everything within 10 light-years to dust. Or regress it all back to primordial atoms. Or both, simultaneously, in different temporal layers. Lysithra moved closer to the crystal, her hand hovering near its surface. Time doesn't follow normal rules here, Blake. Cause and effect become suggestions rather than laws. Blake studied the drive for several minutes, his engineering mind working through the problem. He'd dealt with plenty of malfunctioning equipment in his career, but this was on a completely different level. This wasn't just broken technology. This was a wound in reality itself, and one wrong move could make it catastrophically worse. Then an idea hit him. He pulled up files from his own ship's database, scrolling through technical specifications until he found what he was looking for. Human FTL drives use temporal shielding. Basic stuff, really crude compared to your technology. Other species thought we were idiots for using it because it's inefficient and burns through a ton of power. I'm familiar with human FTL systems, Lysithra said, moving to look at his datapad. But I don't see how that helps us. Your shielding is too primitive. That's exactly why it might work, Blake said, excitement building in his voice. Your technology is all about manipulating time, bending it, controlling it. But human shielding doesn't try to control time at all. It just deflects it like an umbrella in the rain. What if we adapted that principle to your drive? Used it to bleed off the temporal energy gradually instead of trying to control the release? Lysithra's eyes widened as she processed the idea. Her fingers danced through holographic displays that appeared in the air around them, running calculations faster than Blake could follow. That could actually work. Your shielding doesn't interact with the paradox directly, so it won't trigger the feedback loop. It would be like slowly draining a lake instead of blowing up the dam. They threw themselves into the work, their minds operating in perfect synchronization. Blake brought human engineering ingenuity, the kind of creative problem-solving that came from a species that had bootstrapped itself into space with barely functional rockets and pure determination. Lysithra brought 3 centuries of technical knowledge and an understanding of temporal mechanics that no human scientist could match. As they worked, something strange started happening. Blake began experiencing fragments of Lysithra's memories. He felt the crushing weight of her loneliness, the 300 years of isolation stretching out in agonizing detail. He saw her moments of despair, the times she nearly gave up, the determination that kept her going when any sane person would have surrendered. He felt her fear on the day the drive malfunctioned, the split-second decision to sacrifice herself, and the crushing realization of what that sacrifice would actually mean. And Lysithra experienced his memories in return. She saw his childhood on Mars, growing up in the colonial domes where water was rationed and every breath of air was manufactured. She felt his excitement when he joined the military, the pride of serving something bigger than himself. Then came the war, the friends he lost, and the guilt that ate at him every single day. She experienced the moment his squad died, the desperate last stand where he was the only survivor, and the crushing question that haunted him ever since: why did I live when they didn't? They took a break after several hours of work, sitting together in the frozen hangar. Blake's perception of time had completely shifted. He no longer noticed the stillness or the silence. This was his reality now, at least for the moment. You've seen so much death, Lysithra said quietly, not looking at him. So much loss. Yet you keep pushing forward. Humans always do. How do you manage it? How do you deal with the weight of all those ghosts? Blake was quiet for a moment, thinking about all the people he'd lost. His squad. His friends. The civilians he couldn't save. They were with him always, a constant presence in the back of his mind. For years, he'd thought of them as a burden, a weight he had to carry as punishment for surviving. But sitting here with Lysithra, someone who'd carried her own impossible burden for 3 centuries, Blake suddenly saw it differently. Because going backwards isn't an option, he said slowly. And standing still is just a slower way of dying. So forward is all we've got. We carry the people we lost with us, not as weights holding us down, but as reminders of why we keep going. They don't get to see tomorrow, so we have to see it for them. Lysithra laughed, a sound of genuine joy that Blake hadn't heard from her before. I like that philosophy. It's very human. Very you. Yeah, well, we're not known for our subtlety or our patience. But we're really good at being stubborn and refusing to quit. They returned to work with renewed energy, but then Blake felt something shift. The connection between him and normal time, already fragile, began to fail completely. He was being pulled deeper into Lysithra's temporal layer, his last ties to reality dissolving like smoke. If this continued, he wouldn't just be trapped for a few hours or days. He'd be trapped forever just like her. Blake, your readings are destabilizing. Lysithra grabbed his arm, her touch solid and real. You need to sever the connection now before it's too late. Save yourself. Blake looked at her, at the fear and desperation in her eyes, and he realized something. She was more terrified of him being trapped than she'd ever been for herself. After 300 years of isolation, after all the loneliness and pain, her first instinct was still to protect someone else. That was who she was at her core, someone who sacrificed for others. Well, Blake thought stubbornness runs both ways. Not happening, he said firmly. We're in this together now, remember? I'm not leaving you alone again. You fool, Lysithra whispered, and Blake saw tears forming in her strange, beautiful eyes. You beautiful, stupid, stubborn human fool. Blake grinned despite the pain spreading through his body. Yeah, that's pretty much our species in a nutshell. Now stop trying to save me and help me save both of us. We've got a paradox to fix. Blake made his choice in that moment, and it was probably the craziest decision of his entire life. Instead of fighting against the pull into Lysithra's temporal layer, instead of trying to save himself and abandon her, he did the exact opposite. He dove deeper. He let go of his connection to normal time completely and committed himself fully to the space between moments where Lysithra existed. The pain that had been tearing through his body suddenly vanished, replaced by a strange clarity. The world shifted around him, and for the first time, Blake truly understood what Lysithra had been experiencing for 300 years. He could see time now not as a line or a concept but as an actual thing. It was like an ocean, vast and deep, with currents and eddies and waves that moved in patterns he'd never imagined. And he and Lysithra were anchored in the same spot, held in place by the paradox at the heart of the ship. What have you done? Lysithra asked, catching him as his legs gave out. The adjustment period was brutal, and Blake's brain struggled to process his new perception of reality. Something incredibly stupid probably, Blake admitted, his voice shaky. But now we're anchored together. If you're stuck here forever, so am I. Which means we'd better make damn sure neither of us stays stuck. Lysithra's expression shifted from horror to something else, determination mixed with something that looked almost like hope. Then we finish this. Together. No more arguing about who saves who. We both get out or neither of us does. Now you're thinking like a human, Blake said with a weak grin. They returned to the chronometric drive with renewed purpose, and the work went faster now. Blake's fully anchored state meant he could interact with the temporal systems directly. He could see the energy flows, touch the crystalline structure without fear, and make modifications that would have been impossible from normal time. The combination of human and Vendare thinking created solutions neither of them could have found alone. Days passed in the space between moments. Or maybe it was weeks. Time was weird here and Blake stopped trying to keep track. What mattered was the work, and slowly but surely they were making progress. The solution they developed was elegant in its simplicity. By wrapping the chronometric drive in adapted human temporal shielding, they could create a controlled discharge. The energy wouldn't explode outward. Instead, it would bleed off gradually, harmlessly, over the course of several minutes. But there was one massive problem they couldn't solve. Someone has to pilot the ship during the discharge, Lysithra explained, her hands moving through holographic displays showing stress calculations and energy patterns. The temporal forces involved will fluctuate constantly. Any automated system would be torn apart by the contradictions. We need a living mind, something that can adapt and react in real time, to guide the ship through the collapse. Blake studied the numbers and his stomach sank. Guide it from inside the temporal field. Whoever does this will be riding the paradox while it unravels. That sounds incredibly dangerous. It is. The pilot would need to maintain perfect control while reality itself tries to tear them apart. One mistake, one moment of lost focus, and the entire discharge could cascade out of control. Blake looked at Lysithra, then back at the drive. Then we both do it. Two pilots, two minds working together. We've been in sync this whole time. Why stop now? Before Lysithra could respond, a new voice cut through the frozen stillness. It was the timekeeper, speaking with what sounded almost like emotion. I have prepared for this moment for many years. Since you began your work, I have been opening a corridor through the station, clearing a path for your ship to launch. But you must understand the window of opportunity is narrow. You will have one chance to execute this plan. One chance is all we need, Blake said with more confidence than he felt. Over the next several days they prepared everything. Blake and Lysithra linked their minds directly to the ship's control systems, becoming extensions of the vessel itself. As they connected, something unexpected happened. Their consciousness merged even more deeply than before. Blake experienced the full weight of Lysithra's 300-year vigil. Every moment of crushing loneliness, every time she nearly gave up, every flash of hope that kept her going. He felt her fear when the drive first malfunctioned, the nobility of her decision to sacrifice herself, and the slow erosion of her sanity as the centuries dragged on. And Lysithra experienced everything Blake had buried deep inside himself. She felt his childhood dreams of exploring the stars, the pride of joining the military, the bonds of brotherhood with his squad. Then came the war, brutal and unforgiving. She experienced the battle at Titan Station, watching his friends die one by one, using their bodies as cover while he held the line. She felt his survivor's guilt, the crushing weight of being the only one who lived, and the self-destructive pattern he'd fallen into afterward. The dangerous jobs, the reckless behavior, the unconscious death wish hidden behind professional competence. When they finally separated, both of them were crying. They sat together in the ship's core chamber, processing what they'd learned about each other. Blake, Lysithra said softly, you weren't meant to die with your squad. Can't you see that? You survived because the universe needed you here, in this moment, to free me. Your life has meaning beyond that battle. Blake wiped his eyes, feeling something inside him shift. For 5 years he'd been punishing himself for living. But maybe Lysithra was right. Maybe survival wasn't a crime. Maybe it was a responsibility. And you, Blake said, spent 3 centuries holding back a catastrophe that would have killed billions. You're not a victim or a prisoner. You're a hero. The greatest hero nobody ever knew about. They might have said more, but alarms suddenly blared through the ship. The timekeeper's voice returned, urgent now. I am detecting incoming vessels. Multiple ships dropping out of hyperspace near the station. Vendare military signatures. They have found you. Blake and Lysithra rushed to the ship's sensors, accessing data that the timekeeper was feeding them. Sure enough, a fleet of sleek warships was materializing in space around Croner Station. At least 20 vessels, all of them heavily armed, all of them moving into formation. They detected my life signature, Lysithra said, her voice tight with tension. After 300 years, my government finally found me. A transmission came through, cold and bureaucratic. This is Vendare Defense Command. The temporal anomaly at Croner Station has been classified as a threat to galactic security. Any ships attempting to leave the area will be destroyed. Surrender immediately. Blake felt Lysithra's fear through their connection. They're not here to rescue you, are they? No, she whispered. They're here to bury the secret. My government covered up the 7th Fleet disaster. They declared us all dead to hide their failed temporal research program. If I come back, if I testify about what really happened, it would destroy them politically. I'm not a lost princess to them. I'm a loose end that needs to be eliminated. Blake checked their discharge calculations. They needed at least 10 more minutes to finish preparations, but the Vendare fleet would be in firing position within 5. Even if they somehow escaped, Lysithra would spend the rest of her life running or imprisoned, and Blake would probably be killed as an inconvenient witness. That's when the idea hit him. It was insane, reckless, and absolutely impossible. Which meant it was perfectly human. What if we don't shut down the drive? Blake said slowly, his mind racing. What if instead of dissipating the energy we use it? We've got 300 years of stored temporal power in this thing. What if we focus all that energy into one massive jump? Not backwards or sideways through time, but forward. Lysithra stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Forward through time? Blake, that's completely theoretical. Nobody has ever successfully executed a controlled temporal jump of that magnitude. Yeah, but nobody ever held a paradox stable for 300 years either, and you managed that. Look, your government wants to bury you in the past. So let's jump over them entirely. Leap forward in time, past their fleet, past their political regime, past everyone who wants to silence you. How far forward are we talking? Blake pulled up the energy calculations. 500 years. Maybe more. Far enough that your current government has either fallen or reformed. Far enough that the secrets they're trying to hide don't matter anymore. We'd wake up in a galaxy we don't recognize. Everything we know would be ancient history. Our families, our homes, everything would be gone. Blake looked at her seriously. You've already been alone for 3 centuries. At least this time you won't be alone. We'll face whatever future we find together. And honestly, my life in this time isn't exactly something I'm desperate to hold on to. Lysithra was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what Blake was suggesting. Then slowly a smile spread across her face. I've been running from time for 300 years. Maybe it's time we ran ahead of it instead. That's very human thinking. Hey, when you can't win the fight in front of you, change the battlefield. It's what we do best. The timekeeper's voice returned, and for the first time since Blake had met the AI, it sounded almost excited. I must confess something to you both. I was not built in your past. I was built in your future by Vendare who regretted their ancestors' decisions. I was placed here in this time, specifically to ensure this moment could occur. You were always meant to succeed. Now go forward, Commander Blake Carter and Princess Lysithra. Go forward and show them what the future holds. The Vendare fleet closed in, weapons charging with energy signatures that made the ship's sensors scream warnings. Blake and Lysithra had maybe 3 minutes before those warships opened fire, and once they did, even the station's ancient shields wouldn't hold for long. The timekeeper was already opening the launch corridor, massive doors grinding apart to reveal the star-filled void beyond. But that corridor would become a death trap the moment they tried to fly through it. Blake's hands flew across the holographic controls, completely recalculating the discharge sequence they'd spent days perfecting. Instead of bleeding energy off gradually, they were going to channel every ounce of power the chronometric drive had stored over 3 centuries into one focused burst. It was like the difference between letting air out of a balloon slowly versus popping it and trying to ride the explosion. This is absolutely crazy, Lysithra said, but she was already working alongside him, her fingers dancing through Vendare calculations faster than Blake's eyes could follow. We're essentially turning my ship into a temporal missile and hoping we survive the launch. Crazy is kind of humanity's specialty, Blake replied, sweat beading on his forehead as he worked. We reached the moon using computers less powerful than a modern toaster. We colonized Mars before we figured out how to reliably predict weather. If there's a stupid, reckless way to solve a problem, humans will find it and make it work through sheer stubbornness. Despite their desperate situation, Lysithra laughed. Over the past days working together, she'd come to understand humans in a way few aliens ever did. They were a species that looked at impossible odds and took it as a personal challenge. They turned disadvantages into advantages and made strength out of weakness. It was no wonder they'd become such a powerful force in the galaxy despite being relative newcomers to space travel. Another transmission came through from the Vendare fleet, but this time it wasn't the cold bureaucratic voice. It was someone older, with authority that came from years of command. Princess Lysithra, this is Admiral Torvash. I know you can hear me. Stand down. Your ship is damaged and obsolete. You cannot escape. Surrender now, and I give you my word you'll be treated fairly. Lysithra's hands froze over the controls. Blake glanced at her and saw the conflict written across her face. You know him? He was my father's military advisor, Lysithra said quietly. A good man, or at least he was 300 years ago. But he's lying. Even if he personally wants to help me, his superiors won't allow it. The moment I'm in custody, I'll disappear. Political expediency always wins over honor. Blake reached over and put his hand on hers. Through their mental connection, he could feel her pain, her fear, and underneath it all, her bone-deep exhaustion. She was tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of being trapped. Part of her just wanted it to be over, whatever that meant. Hey, Blake said gently. We didn't come this far to give up now. You held that paradox for 3 centuries because you refused to let innocent people die. That's who you are. So let's show these people what determination really looks like. Human and Vendare working together, refusing to accept defeat. What do you say? Lysithra looked at him, and Blake saw the exhaustion fade, replaced by the same fierce determination that had kept her alive through impossible isolation. Let's jump into the future and leave these bastards behind. They finalized the calculations with seconds to spare. The chronometric drive began to spin up, energy building in patterns that made the air itself crackle with power. The ship started to shake, vibrations running through every surface as 300 years of stored temporal energy prepared to release all at once. Outside, the Vendare fleet detected the energy buildup. Blake heard Admiral Torvash's voice again, no longer calm but urgent. All ships, open fire. Don't let that ship activate its drive. Energy beams lanced through space, brilliant streaks of destructive power that converged on the hangar. The first few shots slammed into Cronor Station shields, causing systems throughout the ancient structure to overload. Alarms blared. Emergency lights flickered. The timekeeper's voice cut through the chaos, strained but determined. Launching in 5 seconds. The corridor is clear. May time itself guide your path. Blake and Lysithra's minds merged completely with the ship's systems. They became the vessel, feeling every rivet and circuit as extensions of their own bodies. The chronometric drive reached critical mass, reality itself beginning to bend and warp around them. The ship phased partially out of normal space, becoming translucent, ghostly. 3 seconds, Blake counted down. 2. 1. Go. The ship launched from the hangar like a bullet from a gun, crossing the distance to open space in a fraction of a second. The Vendare fleet fired again, but their weapons passed straight through the vessel. Blake and Lysithra were already halfway into another time, existing in multiple moments simultaneously. The ship was there and not there, real and unreal, present and future all at once. Then the chronometric drive released its full power, and Blake experienced something no human had ever witnessed before. They were riding time itself, surfing along the currents of causality as centuries blurred past in moments. Through the ship's temporal sensors, Blake watched history unfold at impossible speed. He saw the Vendare government that had tried to kill them collapse within 50 years, torn apart by internal corruption and the very lies they'd used to cover up the Seventh Fleet disaster. He saw humanity continue its expansion across the galaxy, their natural temporal resilience making them invaluable as mediators and peacekeepers. New species made first contact, forming alliances and partnerships. Wars flared and ended. Entire civilizations rose to prominence and then faded into memory. Lysithra guided them through the temporal currents with the skill of someone who'd spent 3 centuries existing outside normal time. She knew how to navigate paradoxes and avoid temporal eddies that could trap them. Blake provided the anchor, his human perception of linear time keeping them moving forward instead of scattering across multiple timelines. They saw the year 2600, then 2700, then 2800. The galaxy changed in ways both wonderful and terrifying. Technology advanced beyond anything they recognized. Political boundaries shifted and reformed. At some point around the year 2850, Blake caught glimpses of what looked like the Temporal Reconciliation Act, some kind of galactic treaty that legitimized and regulated time travel technology. The research Lysithra had died trying to protect had finally become accepted, understood, and used responsibly. At year 2900, they saw references to something called the Temporal Anchor Initiative, a cooperative program between humans and reformed Vendare to train specialists in chronometric rescue and stabilization. Humanity's unique perception of time had become recognized as a crucial galactic resource. Finally, at 512 years after they'd launched, the ship began to solidify back into normal space. The temporal jump was completing, the stored energy nearly exhausted. Blake and Lysithra guided their vessel through the final moments of transition, and then with a flash of blue light, they emerged into a new era. They were still in orbit around Cronor Station, but the ancient derelict they remembered had been completely transformed. The station gleamed with fresh metal and new construction. Ships of dozens of species moved in and out of its docking bays. The entire structure had been converted into something magnificent, a hub of activity and life instead of a forgotten ruin. Their communications console immediately lit up with incoming messages. Dozens of them from ships of species Blake recognized and many he didn't. One voice came through clearly, speaking in perfect English with barely controlled excitement. "Unknown vessel, this is Cronor Traffic Control. Please transmit your identification codes." "Wait, I'm reading your ship's signature and I can't believe what I'm seeing." "Computer, verify these readings. Is that really a Vendare 7th Fleet chronometric vessel? The Princess's Vigil? That's impossible. That ship is a legend." Blake and Lysithra looked at each other in confusion. "The Princess's Vigil?" Blake asked. Lysithra pulled up the historical databases of this new era, accessing the public information networks. What she found made her breath catch. Their story had become legend. The tale of Princess Lysithra who sacrificed herself to contain a paradox, holding it stable for 3 centuries while her ship drifted through time, preserving crucial knowledge about temporal mechanics that would eventually save countless lives. The ship itself had become a symbol, a reminder of the cost of reckless experimentation and the nobility of sacrifice. People thought she was dead. They thought the ship had been destroyed or lost forever in some temporal void. But the knowledge she'd been protecting, the research data stored in the ship's computers, had somehow been recovered in pieces over the centuries. It had formed the foundation of modern temporal science. A mixed fleet was approaching now, not with weapons but with ceremonial formations. Blake saw human ships flying alongside Vendare vessels, plus craft from at least a dozen other species. They formed an honor guard around the ancient ship, welcoming them home. A new transmission came through, this one on an official diplomatic channel. The speaker was Vendare, but her voice carried warmth instead of the cold bureaucracy Blake remembered. Princess Lysithra, Commander Blake Carter of Earth, on behalf of the Galactic Temporal Council, welcome to the 31st century. We thought you were lost forever. Your sacrifice and the knowledge you preserved changed our entire civilization. You're not fugitives here. You're heroes. Blake felt tears streaming down his face. Beside him, Lysithra was openly crying, centuries of pain and fear finally releasing. They'd done it. They'd escaped not just the trap of the paradox, but the trap of a time that wanted to silence them. They'd leaped forward into a future that understood and valued what they'd been through. The timekeeper's voice came through the ship's internal systems one last time. My purpose is complete. I have guided you to this moment across 5 centuries. But if you will have me, I would like to continue forward with you. I have grown fond of this journey and of you both. You're always welcome with us, Lysithra said, her voice thick with emotion. You saved us both. You're part of this crew now. Over the following weeks, Blake and Lysithra adapted to their new era. It was overwhelming at first. 500 years of history to catch up on, technology they didn't understand, and a galaxy that had changed in ways both subtle and profound. But they weren't alone. The people of this new era welcomed them warmly, understanding that they were refugees from time itself. Blake learned that humanity had become a major galactic power, respected not for military might but for their unique abilities as temporal anchors and mediators. The stubborn determination that had once been seen as a human quirk was now recognized as a crucial survival trait. Humans could stabilize temporal anomalies naturally, making them invaluable in rescue operations and scientific research. The Vendare had transformed entirely after their government's collapse. They'd built a new society based on transparency, cooperation, and ethical use of temporal technology. The cover-up of the Seventh Fleet disaster had become a cautionary tale taught in their schools, a reminder of what happened when political expediency trumped truth and honor. Blake and Lysithra were offered positions as ambassadors, using their unique experience to help others understand temporal phenomena. Their ship, officially designated the Princess's Vigil by the historical records, became a research vessel. With the Timekeeper AI integrated into its systems, they explored the boundaries of time itself, helping to rescue others trapped in temporal anomalies and advancing the science that Lysithra had nearly died to preserve. One evening, Blake stood on the ship's observation deck, watching stars stream past as they traveled to their next assignment. He thought about his old life, the guilt and aimless drifting, the dangerous jobs that were slowly killing him. That version of Blake seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. Lysithra joined him, slipping her hand into his. They'd been through so much together that words often felt unnecessary. Through their still-linked minds, they shared thoughts and feelings more directly than speech could convey. Do you ever regret it? Lysithra asked, though Blake knew she already sensed his answer. Everything you left behind? The life you could have had. Blake thought about his answer carefully. He'd left behind the guilt, yes, but also the friends who'd survived the war, the familiar places, the version of Earth he'd known. 500 years had passed. Everyone he'd known was long dead. His entire era had become history. But he'd gained something infinitely more valuable. He'd found purpose beyond survival. He'd proven that being in the wrong place at the right time could change everything. He'd saved someone who desperately needed saving and been saved in return. Most importantly, he'd learned that his survival hadn't been a mistake or a curse. It had been preparation for this moment, for this mission, for this life. Not for a second, Blake said honestly. I spent 5 years punishing myself for living when my squad died. But you taught me something important. They didn't die so I could waste my life feeling guilty. They died so I could live fully, so I could be here when you needed someone to hear your call. Their sacrifice led to this, to us, to all the good we're doing now. That gives their deaths meaning. Lysithra rested her head on his shoulder, and Blake felt her contentment through their bond. You know what I realized? She said. I spent 3 centuries trapped between moments, experiencing time in ways nobody should ever have to endure. But those 3 centuries led me to you. They prepared me to guide us through that temporal jump. Without that experience we never would have survived. Sometimes the worst things we go through are preparing us for the best things yet to come. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars. Somewhere behind them in time, Admiral Torvash and his fleet were still searching for a ship that had vanished 5 centuries ago. Somewhere in the past, Blake's old self was taking dangerous salvage jobs and slowly destroying himself with guilt. Somewhere in history, Lysithra was sealing herself into a temporal prison, believing she'd die alone and forgotten. But here, in this moment, in this time, they were free. They were together. They were moving forward, always forward, because that's what survivors did. They carried their pain and their losses not as weights dragging them down, but as reminders of why each new moment mattered. A notification came through from the Temporal Council. Another rescue mission, another person trapped in a temporal anomaly that conventional teams couldn't reach. Another chance to use their unique experience to save someone the way they'd saved each other. Blake felt Lysithra's determination through their bond, matching his own. "Ready?" he asked. She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd survived the impossible and come out stronger. "Always. Time to show them what a human and a Vendare can do when they work together." Their ship turned toward their new destination, leaving trails of light across the darkness of space. Behind them lay 5 centuries of history, pain, and sacrifice. Ahead lay infinite possibilities, challenges they'd face together, and a future they'd fought harder than anyone to reach. The timekeeper's voice hummed contentedly through the ship's systems. "Forward, always forward. I do believe I'm going to enjoy this era very much." And in the space between moments, in the quantum realm where past and future touched, time itself seemed to whisper its approval. 2 souls who'd been trapped by time had learned to ride it instead. A human who saw time as an arrow and a Vendare who'd experienced it as an ocean had found common ground and simply moving forward, one moment after another, together. Blake squeezed Lysithra's hand. 500 years from their origin point, in a galaxy they barely recognized, they'd finally found what they'd both been searching for all along. Not escape from time, but the freedom to move through it on their own terms, anchored not by paradox or guilt, but by purpose, partnership, and the simple human philosophy that had saved them both. When you can't fight the present, leap into the future. And when you get there, make it better than the past you left behind. That was the human way. And now it was their way too.